This is the Comics Alternative Manga. Reviews of Frankenstein, a Junji Ito Story Collection, and Dementia 21. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Manga. I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
And we're two scholars who really enjoy talking about manga. And on this, our official December show, because if you remember, Shea, we've already had a December show, but it was technically our November show. But this is our official December show, which is actually coming out in December, the tail end, but nonetheless December. We're going to be looking at two relatively recent releases. First, we're going to look at Frankenstein, the Junji Ito Story Collection. And then after that, we're going to check out Shintaro Kago's Dementia 21. But before we get to that discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Manga is brought to you by the good folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics and manga pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts will be anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover. But occasionally, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
Like in the month of December, you can get manga like Rurouni Kenshin for 30% off, and you can get manga-related books like Hirohiko Araki's Manga in Theory and Practice for 30% off.
You know, it's a great place to find a variety of comics, manga and otherwise. That's Discount Comic Book Service. Head over to their website, dcbservice.com, because they will take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Shea and Derek sent you. So, Shea, here we are. I guess we're still technically in the midst of the holiday season. As we record this, we've already gone through Christmas. In several days, we will have New Year's. So, has this been a pretty good break for you?
Yeah, it's been, I think, pretty productive. I've gotten a chance to read some comics. I got a chance to finally read it's not a manga, but I got a chance to read Grim Wilkins' Miranda from Image Comics that I thought was terrific. And a couple other titles that I'm having a difficult time recalling now. Some nice Koosh minis that they sent me. Got a chance to read those.
I love Koosh.
Yeah, they're always those little like 20-page comics they do are always pretty fun. So I've gotten a chance to just kind of kick back and enjoy some of that stuff, and then I've got a chance to read a lot of other less exciting books that our listeners are likely not as interested in as I am, but that's fine. But yeah, it's been pretty good. I know you've done a little bit of traveling this holiday. How's that been for you?
It was fine. I went up to northern Indiana to spend time with family, specifically at my mother-in-law's, and had a really nice, relaxing time. I also took with me quite a bit of reading, because like you, I wanted to use this time to catch up with a lot of things. And on the one hand, I have done a lot of reading and kind of caught up in some ways, but most of the reading I've been doing is for the podcast because I work with so many of the shows and do a number of interviews. So sometimes it's like treading water to keep up with everything, but I've been able to do that. One of the things I didn't get to do that I planned to do, I wanted to start Rumiko Takahashi's Ranma 1/2, because that's I've read some of Takahashi's work in the past, and later on in 2019, I think she has a new series that's going to be translated, or a series that's going to be translated English for the first time, coming out from VIZ, if I'm not mistaken. I can't remember the title, but I've been meaning to read her Ranma 1/2 for years, and I have a few of these 3-in-1 volumes that VIZ has put out. Took them with me to Indiana, didn't pick up a one, unfortunately. But that's still on my to-read list.
Yeah, that might be one might be one worth doing on a future episode of the podcast. I've also got I don't know if I've got like the complete run of they're not the 3-in-1s, but they're the 2-in-1s. They're still the tankobon size, but they're thicker. I've got the first like 15 or so of those. So yeah, that might be something to do in the future. You're right. They are 2-in-1, not 3-in-1. Okay. I know that VIZ does a number of 3-in-1 editions, but I just looked it up, and with the Ranma, it is the 2-in-1. So I have some of those. I don't have, like you said, the complete run, but I've got a good start. Yeah, I didn't realize that was a series that you were interested in reading, but I think that would be a really good one, maybe for a future episode, because I would definitely like to hear what you think of it.
It is. I've read Takahashi's, or at least a good bit of Takahashi's Maison Okuko, and I really enjoyed that. And I think the idea, I hadn't thought about this, but your idea of maybe using one of our monthly manga shows to discuss Ranma 1/2 is really good. And in fact, we've talked about doing something like this with Tezuka's Buddha. A kind of, an older series, a longer series, and then using one of our manga monthly shows just to look at that, which I still want to do. I mean, I was thinking about that just yesterday, in fact, that we should get back to that idea of looking at the run of Buddha. But, we can use these monthly shows to look at older series, either the entire run or at least as much as we can get through. What we've been doing for, let's say, most of the past 2 or 3 years, though, we've been trying to keep up with relatively recent or brand new manga releases from a variety of different publishers, which is fine. I enjoy doing that. I feel like I can keep up with a lot of things that I want to keep up with in terms of new manga releases. But then using the time to go back and look at some of these older titles, like we did with our very first episode, right? One of the titles we looked at was Akira. We looked at that complete run. So I enjoy doing that. Maybe we can do more of that in 2019.
Yeah, I think one of the things doing the show is kind of acutely reminds me of is that there are literal mountains. You could pile the volumes to create literal mountains of series that I sound great, that are really sound really appealing. But when am I going to get the time to read 40 volumes of like this manga from the 70s? So yeah, I think that might be worth kind of setting a New Year's resolution for more older stuff on the show.
Okay, let's, I guess, not look at older stuff, but look at, like, for this episode, newer releases, or at least newer releases that have come out in English from a couple of different publishers. And we're specifically interested in what VIZ Media and Fantagraphics has come out with over the past few months. We're going to begin with VIZ Media's release of Junji Ito's Frankenstein, the Junji Ito Story Collection. This came out back in October. And the thing about this book, it is a nice hardbound edition, which is something that VIZ has been doing over the past several years, right? Coming out with these nice hardbound volumes of Ito's work. And many of them we have discussed in the past. I'm thinking of Tomi and Guro, which was on a very early episode of the manga series.
Maybe even our first or second.
Yeah, it was the first or second, I think. Maybe the second. They've also come out with a hardbound complete edition of Uzumaki, and then some of the other books that they've released have been in hardbound as well. Fragments of Horror, I think Shiver, and maybe Dissolving Classroom was hardbound. I can't recall. And then there's the new one that's coming out later in 2019, Smashed, another story collection. But this one is Frankenstein. It's a collection of stories, and this is something that I want us to discuss. Not so much the content of the stories, which I want to do that, of course, but the arrangement and I guess the overall package of this book, because the vast majority of it, not quite half, is taken up by Ito's adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Then we have a series of 6 stories that involve a young man by the name of Oshikiri. And then there are a couple of stories, The Hell of the Doll Funeral and Face Firmly in Place, that have nothing to do with Oshikiri, but are just different horror stories. And then there are 2 short pieces about Junji Ito's dog called Non, or Bus Non, and the stories are Bus Non and Hide and Seek with Bus Non. In many ways, this is, I don't know, do we want to call it a hodgepodge of narratives, of horror narratives from Junji Ito that may or may not, depending on your point of view, fit nicely together?
I would describe it as a hodgepodge of narratives, because I don't think that I think, like you said, there's this big chunk of the book that's given over to one kind of narrative, the Frankenstein adaptation. And then you get a bunch of these Oshikiri stories. And then, like you said, you get these kind of assortment of other stories, some of which are horror, some of which are not. The 2 Boss Non stories you mentioned are, they're very similar to his Cat Diary comics, so they're not horror necessarily.
Oh, Yun and Mu.
Yeah. So I would say that, but even in the Oshikiri stories, there's no real. They're very much like the Tomi stories, where each one sort of is self-contained. There's no kind of continuity between them, right? It's clearly the same character. It's clearly the same figure. He looks the same. He behaves the same. But even in those, it's not like one narrative. It's multiple going on. And so I would say that a hodgepodge is probably the most accurate way to describe it, though, based on my limited understanding of kind of how this book was originally published in Japanese as just a volume in a kind of a collection of short stories by, I think it's the 16th volume in just this long-running series of anthologies collecting his work. I don't know if there is supposed to be any sort of organizing logic to any of these. I think it's supposed to stand as a just kind of as a kind of anthology, right? As this kind of hodgepodge where some things are going to work and some things are not going to work for you. I mean, is that sort of the sense that you got from it as well?
Yeah, it is. And you had mentioned that with the Oshikiri stories, there didn't seem to be. Well, you didn't put it in this way, cohesion. In other words, the stories could stand alone, and I think to a large degree that is the case. However, the thing that struck me about the 6 Oshikiri tales is that if you take them by themselves, that they function in many ways kind of like, I'm sure we discussed this, it's been about at least 3 years since we looked at Tomi. But I'm sure that the term graphic cycle, the comics equivalent of a short story cycle came up. And I think the Oshikiri stories are a graphic cycle. One can stand on its own apart from the others. However, if you take all 6 together, it gives a more complete picture. So, for instance, the very first Oshikiri story, Next Spectre, which, again, you got to hand it to Junji Ito to take the strangest, most offbeat grotesqueness, right? And spin it sometimes almost literally, with Uzumaki in such a way that it just becomes strangely horrific. Now, you would expect in terms of horror something like the eye to be prominent, right? Or maybe even the mouth, but the neck. And so one of the things that Oshikiri witnesses at the beginning of the story, we see that he's burying a friend of his that he ended up killing because his friend was too tall. And Oshikiri keeps referring to himself as a shrimp, and he's a little self-conscious about that. But as he's burying his friend, he notices that the corpse's neck seems to get longer and longer. And then other parts of bodies, especially necks, in this story become longer and kind of freak him out. So there's the horror aspect. But anyway, when you see this first story and how it ends up, it makes sense in and of itself. But then when you start reading the other stories like Bog of Living Spirits and Pen Pal, you're wondering, is this the same Oshikiri? But then as you read on, you start realizing that not only is there a horror element in these stories, the 6 Oshikiri stories, but also there is a trans-dimensional aspect of these stories as well. And so when you read The Strange Tale of Oshikiri, the story, and then The Strange Tale of Oshikiri, the walls, you realize, or by this point you know, that there's something about his family's house where there is a dimensional portal. And so many of the strange things that he experiences or he hears or he witnesses is because of this migration from one dimension to another, where there's an alternative Oshikiri, and he even confronts himself in one of these later stories. And it just becomes really weird. So, but if you took just Next Spectre by itself, that's one thing. But when you read it within the context of all the other stories, it takes on a greater resonance. And so that's why I look at these 6 Oshikiri stories as a great example of Ito doing a graphic cycle, kind of like the Tomy stories.
Yeah, no, I think a graphic cycle is a pretty good way to describe it, because I think it does get at the way that each of these stories does sort of, there's a kind of internal coherence, to use your word, right? Like you can pick up any one of these stories and it's kind of self-contained. It doesn't rely on knowledge of the other ones. But you're right, there are elements in these other stories, or in various of these other stories, that kind of hint at ways in which these stories may be read together as a kind of single, not a single narrative, but a kind of interrelated, a kind of assemblage of narratives. So I think that term, that way of thinking about it is that wasn't how I was thinking of it as I was reading it, but yeah, I do think that's probably the best way to get at the way that each one of these things kind of stands alone, but it also has these interrelated qualities as well, in kind of weird and interesting ways. Yeah, it's interesting that you brought up the Oshikiri stories first. And you mentioned this sort of the similarity they have to Tomy, and that was kind of how I was thinking of them as well. It was very similar to the way that Tomy is written. It's these kind of short, simple, effective, kind of pulpy horror stories featuring a kind of a protagonist or a character, a figure, kind of moving from scenario to scenario. And really all that matters is what happens within this individual scenario. I think reading that is when I realized, I think, why I was enjoying, why I enjoyed the Frankenstein narrative so much, which precedes this in the VIZ collection. And like you said, kind of earlier in the show, it takes up the bulk of the book, and it's the, it's where the book gets its title, right? And one of the things we've talked about over the last couple of years is we've talked about how big a fan of Junji Ito we both are, and we've talked about a number of Junji Ito books on the show. But one of the things, and I'm not sure how much we've talked about it on the show, but we've certainly talked about it either on mic or off mic. We've talked about how his more recent stuff, and I don't mean stuff that's been translated recently, but stuff that he's produced more recently, hasn't had the same impact. It's not been as effective as the other titles like Gyo or Uzumaki that we looked at, that he was producing at the kind of peak of his career. And I found myself pretty greatly enjoying both the Frankenstein narrative and then the God, I just blanked on his name.
Oshikiri.
The Oshikiri stories. They seemed to be I don't know this for sure, so I can't say whether or not these are from earlier in his career. But the sense I got from them is that this was work he was producing from that time, where he was producing things like Kyo and Uzumaki and a lot of those Tomi stories. And I think because of that, it's I was kind of hesitant to look at this book actually because of the recent spate of Junji Ito books that had been a little disappointing. I was a little hesitant to look at this, but I found that I did find myself enjoying this in the way that I kind of am accustomed to enjoying Junji Ito. Did you find that as well? Did you see this as I hate to use the term return to form because, like I said, I don't actually know when this material was originally published in Japanese, but in terms of his American publishing output, the output of his translators, right? This does seem to be a sort of return to form, a return to the Junji Ito that I had originally kind of become a fan of. Did you find that to be the case as well?
Yes and no, and what I mean by that is that. Okay, well, first let me say that, as you were talking about our experiences reading past works by Junji Ito, I went through and started to look to see, well, okay, what exactly did we discuss in the past? And you're right. I think it was our second show, which was in April of 2015, if I'm not mistaken. We did look at Gero, and then we looked on our horror show, which unfortunately we weren't able to do this year. I'm sorry about that. But because I always enjoy those. But in 2016, we looked at his collection, Fragments of Horror. And I think that's when you and I began to comment that it's okay, but it's not Uzumaki, it's not Gero. And then we looked at the Tomi collection in December of 2016. And then during our 2017 horror manga cavalcade, we looked at the collection Dissolving Classroom. And I think that one I wasn't overly thrilled with, in many ways similar to my experiences with Fragments of Horror. So getting back to your question, I do think that it's, if not a return to form, because as you mentioned, we don't know when these were originally written, but a return of my appreciation of Junji Ito. If I take certain parts of this Frankenstein collection separately, if I take them together, I feel a little mixed. Now, what I mean by that is I think that this book, we've called it a hodgepodge a couple of times, and the hodgepodgeness about it is that the editors, or maybe Ito himself in this translation, chose to include so many disparate kind of works that the book seems all over the place. And again, I understand what Viz is attempting to do with these hardbound editions, as I mentioned earlier, but still, there just seems to be a little all over the placeness with this book. I think that if we had just a text with the Mary Shelley Frankenstein adaptation, that would be fine. If we had a book with just the 6 Oshikiri stories, that would be fine. But what we have is the adaptation, the Oshikiri cycle, and then several other things, 2 of which are horror, the Hell of the Doll Funeral, and then Face Firmly in Place, and then the whole dog thing, right? The Boss Non short stories. And, they may be good enough in and of themselves or by themselves. I mean, I like Face Firmly in Place, especially because I think it's something that you don't necessarily think of as horrific, but there's something almost Edgar Allan Poe-esque about that. This young woman who has her head, held firmly in place for the doctor to take a look at, and then something happens to the doctor, and she's there in this office by herself and can't move, and there's something kind of scary and disconcerting about that. But I think that if it were just Frankenstein or just the Oshikiri stories, that'd be one thing. But you put all this stuff together, and it's like, what is the author and publisher attempting to do here? And it leaves me with a perplexed feeling.
No, I think that's right. I think the book as a whole does sort of stand as this weird. Like you said, we keep saying hodgepodge. I agree that it's. Yeah, I guess to maybe refine what I was saying is that I think that each of the stories here, it demonstrates in some capacity. I think Junji Ito's strengths as a cartoonist. I thought the Oshikiri stories were very similar to the Tomy stories, and I thought the Tomy stories were not particularly his strongest writing. I thought they were short, they were largely inconsequential. Some of them were quite scary, some of them were not. It was kind of hit or miss, very much like Twilight Zone episodes. But I thought his art in those was much stronger than the kind of more recent art from him that I'd seen. And then the Frankenstein one, I like you, I would have preferred to have that in a kind of self-contained thing, and I think it's long enough to warrant it. But there, I thought Junji Ito his writing and his art were both far more careful and far more controlled, far more prudent, I think, in his storytelling than his more recent things, which very much played up I think both in art and in narrative, they really played up the grotesque elements of his work, so much so that it was almost like he was doing a kind of parody of himself. Or he was trying to imitate his own earlier work. Whereas I thought his earlier work was so strong because it did have this kind of balance of different kinds of horror. It had a certain amount of restraint, had a certain amount of prudence, and I think the art and the writing in both the Frankenstein and the Oshikiri stories kind of evidence that, and so I was really struck by those in particular. Like you said, I think some of the other stories are kind of interesting. They're kind of fine short stories. I will admit I didn't really think much at all of those the Boss Non stories. They were. I mean, the stories themselves were sort of fine. I've never really been a fan of Junji Ito's. they were cute. You know, and I kind of can see why people would enjoy them or would enjoy something like the Cat Diaries, but I've just never really been that interested in his kind of slice of life comics, if we want to call them that, or his kind of satirical, you know, slice of life comics from the perspective of his pets. I haven't been particularly interested in those, but yeah, I think I don't mean to say that the book as a whole, as a kind of a unified thing, works, because I'm not really convinced that it does. I think one of the things you've been hitting on throughout our conversation is a kind of incoherence, right? And it's a kind of tonal incoherence. It's a kind of narrative thematic incoherence. It's very much like you know, like a sort of, you know, it's everything people say is wrong with the anthology format. You know, it's this thing it's just a bunch of different things kind of cobbled together. There's really no relationship between one story and another story, you know, and I don't necessarily find that to be the case with anthologies, but I do think that description of the stereotypical anthology, I think is kind of it's present here. I do think that it is a kind of incoherent thing as a book, but I think individually there are huge chunks of it that I think remind me of this earlier Junji Ito that I really fell in love with, and it sounds like that might be the kind of sense you got of the book as well.
Yeah, and so getting back to what we were discussing in terms of this being a collection of disparate parts, kind of like, the Frankenstein monster itself, put together in kind of an awkward, strange, and horrific manner. And I don't want to suggest that Junji Ito's book, Frankenstein, that we're discussing, is something repulsive like the monster that Victor Frankenstein creates. It's not that at all. I'm not being unkind there. But I think that it is made up of very different things. So if I take the Oshikiri stories by themselves, I really do appreciate them much more so than I do as a part of this overall text that we're discussing, Frankenstein, Junji Ito Story Collection. Same thing, I think, can be said with the Frankenstein adaptation. And we've talked quite a bit about the Oshikiri stories. I do want to spend some time talking about the Frankenstein adaptation. I have to say, Shea, I was rather impressed with what Ito did with the Frankenstein story. And this is, again, not, as I said earlier, not quite half of the text, but it's a good chunky narrative. It's about 180 some pages of story. And so it takes up, a good part of the text's real estate, so to speak. And I think he does a fairly good job in terms of adapting. And what I mean by a fairly good job, I'm not one of those who believes that the success or even failure of a work of adaptation, from one medium to another, is fidelity to the original. And in fact, many times I prefer and very much appreciate it when a creator in another media from the original takes the original and gives it a particular spin depending on what she or he is wanting to do with the narrative that he or she is adapting. I think that for the most part, Ito was fairly true to the original Mary Shelley Frankenstein romance, with a few exceptions. Now, I am really pleased by the fact that Ito chose to retain the narrative frames, because if listeners recall, if they've read Shelley's Frankenstein, one of the things that I think distinguishes this, not only as a novel, but specifically as a romance, and by romance, I don't mean like a heartthrob, sentimental kind of romance, but in a more traditional literary sense that we were getting from 18th and 19th century, British and American literatures and Germanic literature especially. So the original begins as an epistolary narrative, right? We have Captain Walton, who is trying to make his way to the North Pole, and he begins writing letters to his sister about what's happening. And that's how we get an introduction to Victor Frankenstein in the first sighting of the monster. Okay, of Frankenstein's creation, sledding. It's kind of a spooky image, really.
Oh no,
across.
that was the when the for listeners who haven't, there's like this who haven't read the book. There's like this 2-panel thing. I think it's like 2 or 3 panels, and it's the captain of the ship, Captain Walton. I think he looks out through like a spyglass, and he just sees this like figure riding a sled, and it is you're right to say it's creepy. Like that was like the 2 or 3 panel sequence, and it happens very early on in the book when I was like, oh well, this is like the Junji Ito I kind of know and love, right? It's a weird moment, right? It's strange and uncomfortable, and because of the way he draws Frankenstein's monster is so strange, but the way he kind of obscures the figure in that panel, so it's still a kind of mysterious, weird entity kind of gleefully dog sledding across like the Arctic Circle. I think you're right to say that was like the moment I knew that I was going to like this.
Yeah.
Was that.
And that tone that Ito strikes in those panels that you just described, I think is very much in keeping with the tone of the original Shelley novel, because I remember the first time I read Frankenstein, and this was in graduate school in a British lit course, a Victorian lit course. I even thought that early on in the novel, that scene was really creepy, right? So you have this captain looking out and seeing this mysterious, disfigured looking form sledding across the ice in what seems to be, in terms of the kind of a barren landscape, so to speak, right? This frozen barren landscape. So there's something rather creepy about that. And I think that Ito really captures that here. But getting back to what I was saying, the thing I like about this is that Ito is retaining these narrative frames. Now, we don't get Captain Walton telling us this through letters. So this is not, I guess, the comics equivalent of an epistolary narrative, but we do get the outer frame of Walton and his experiences. And then he eventually finds Victor Frankenstein, who's about to die from hypothermia, brings him on the ship. And then we have an inner narrative frame where Victor tells his story to Walton, Captain Walton. And then within Victor Frankenstein's story, we get yet another frame narrative. The inner narrative of Victor Frankenstein's, the embedded narrative, is the creature's story about what he experienced after being brought to life and then running away. And so you have a story within a story within a story, at least, in the original novel, and Ito retains this series of framed or embedded narratives in the manga version, and I think quite well. And so I really did appreciate that, because it would have been fairly easy to take, let's say, the Victor Frankenstein story without Walton and just present what most people know of as Frankenstein, through popular film, television, and all of that. But what Ito does is he gives us Captain Walton in full, because we see him at the very beginning, we see him at the end after Victor dies, and what he, decides to do toward the end of the story. So I really do appreciate what Ito did in terms of, so to speak, being true to the embedded or framed narratives.
Yeah, no, I think like you, I also, I'm not the biggest fan, admittedly, of the original novel, and that has more to do with I'm not the biggest fan of a lot of like 19th century the kind of aesthetic that is dominant in 19th century prose, I tend not to have the most enjoyable time with. So I'm not the biggest fan of the original novel, but like you, I am glad that he retained a lot of those elements from the original novel, because I think that forced him to a level of restraint, it forced him on a kind of, it forced his narrative on a certain pace, right? That he had to balance and maintain, right? And I think ultimately that was to the adaptation's benefit, right? But I also like the way that he, while still retaining a lot of those, I think a lot of the narrative and thematic elements of the original, he also kind of imports his own aesthetic and thematic concerns, right? Concerns of madness, concerns of the body, concerns of the grotesque, concerns of this divide between the normal and the abnormal, and things like that, as well as bringing in elements from, like some of you mentioned. A lot of people are largely familiar with the Frankenstein story through film and television, through pop culture, right? And I do like that he did bring in certain elements from the James Whale movie, and from like The Bride of Frankenstein, right? Like there's a scene in this where he forces Victor to kind of build him a bride, right? So it's in, like you said, in many ways it's very, very, very close to the novel, right? It's operating along similar kind of formal lines, right? But in other ways, he's kind of taking from other adaptations as well. And so I thought that was interesting, and I was ultimately just impressed that he was able to find a balance between those two things, right? Between these elements taken from the original and elements taken from other adaptations, and then as well as kind of infusing his own sort of style into the book as well. I found this. I found it, I think, because it retained a lot of that creepiness, like you said, from that is present in Shelley's original, because he was able to kind of capture that and reproduce it. I think the work is a lot more frightening, I think genuinely kind of grotesque and disturbing than those earlier, than like who played Frankenstein, Lon Chaney. Ito's Frankenstein is I think far more horrific, and I think far closer to the grotesquerie that I think Shelley wrote about than any film adaptation I've ever seen. But at the same time, I think he does manage to update the story in a way that makes it a really compelling read. Right, it's really easy to read. Like you said, it's like 180 some odd pages, and it's really easy to just breeze through it, because it does have kind of the visual pace of a kind of modern comic.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned the scene where the creature forces or convinces, persuades Victor to make him a bride. I'm glad that you mentioned that scene, because, even though I said I'm not a stickler for verisimilitude to the original, right, or fidelity to the original, I nonetheless am interested to see how an adapted narrative adheres to the original, especially in another medium, and then veers off, and for what purposes. What is the reason to do that? And I think where Ito took the most noticeable liberties in the story proper, and I don't include his choice not to make this an epistolary narrative, because I don't know how effective that would be in the comics medium anyhow, but But I think the most liberty that he took with tweaking the story, Shelley's original, is with the scene where Victor is making the creature a bride. Now, in the original, what happens is, as in the graphic novel, the creature is keeping his eye, so to speak, on Victor after he charges him with creating a bride for him. And in the original Shelley romance, Victor comes to realize after he creates this female creature that could be a companion to the monster, he destroys her, right? He says, I can't do this. This is just so horrific. I'm not going to be a party to this. And so when he destroys his second creation, the bride for Frankenstein's monster, then that's when the creature goes ballistic and goes crazy and then starts going on a killing rampage, with Henry and then with Elizabeth, Victor's bride. In the manga adaptation, though, it's actually the creature that ends up killing the bride, which I thought was an interesting twist. And it's almost as if he inadvertently killed the bride because the way that the bride reacted to the creature, the Frankenstein's monster, was completely unexpected, at least by the creature. And I think one of the reasons for that is another change that Ito chose to insert from the original, and that is that in the manga version, Victor Frankenstein uses the head of Justine, who is the maid or the attendant of the Frankenstein family, who's actually hung for the murder of young William, Victor Frankenstein's youngest brother, although she didn't do it. But Victor ends up getting her head, because it's relatively fresh, putting it on the bride creature, and it's the heads, I guess, of Justine that screams in horror when she wakes up and is reanimated and finds the monster. But again, that's not in the original. But I thought it made sense, right? So this was not just changes to the original narrative that Ito made haphazardly and out of the blue. I mean, there was a purpose behind them, I think. I was fine with that. I just found it interesting that Ito chose to tweak that part of the narrative and not others.
Yeah, it is. I guess, it's hard to talk about really because it's been so long since I've read the novel. My knowledge of the kind of finer points of how, like, what actually happens with Justine in the novel, are largely forgotten. But it might be interesting to go back and reread the novel in light of Ito's adaptation to kind of more thoroughly look at kind of what he's changing, because you're right. They are in certain ways kind of massive divergences from the narrative of the novel. But it's all, I think, consistent with the story that Ito is telling, right? Like you said, there's when the bride or the female monster is brought to life, she kind of screams in horror, and that scene is so strange. It's so weird because it's. I mean, if we want to call her Justine, it's her head. Justine and the original monster are like communing with each other through these like guttural screeches. I mean, it looks like a cartoon of two chimpanzees getting mad at one another, right? It's like the ooh, like getting louder and louder and louder until it becomes like a screech, this like, this like guttural kind of just like sound. And it is such a weird scene. They really are. They're like, their bodies are like contorted in weird ways, and they are just screaming at each other. And it's a really unusual scene. I'm still not entirely sure if they were like trying to communicate with one another, if they were just yelling at one another, you know, what exactly was going on there. And like I said, I don't remember every detail of the novel, but I am pretty positive that scene was not in it. But it does, you know, it works in the context of this adaptation, right? It works from what we know and of the monster, kind of what we know he looks like, how we know he behaves, right? Like what we know of the way he thinks, right? You know, what his own experience kind of coming alive is like, and the way that Ito has drawn him, right? This scene of like a newborn who is in so much pain that they just want to die almost is it's frightening and it's weird, but it totally makes sense. And I think that was what was most impressive to me about this adaptation was that Ito was able to. I mean, he does play pretty fast and loose with a lot of the source material, right? He's kind of transposing certain elements, certain scenes from various film adaptations, along with a already kind of modified, already sort of truncated narrative, and the fact that he was able to combine those two things in the way that he did, and still make it feel so clearly and so strongly like a Junji Ito comic, I thought was the most impressive. Right, there's a kind of deftness to his writing here that I think is emblematic of what at various points in his career Ito has been capable of, and I really did not think I was going to enjoy it for some of the reasons we've talked about throughout the show, but I found myself really, really enjoying his Frankenstein adaptation.
Yeah, you know, as much as I appreciated and enjoyed the Oshikiri stories that followed, I think that if I had to pick one element of this collection that really stood out, it's the Frankenstein adaptation.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's definitely it's clear why. I can't remember. Did I mention this on mic? I definitely mentioned it to you, but I think the book is an adaptation of just like this like series of Ito anthologies, and I don't think in the original this was sold as like, you know, what's the title of this one?
Yeah, you did mention that earlier in the show. Yeah,
you know, Junji Ito's Frankenstein is the name of this one, right? What's the full title? I don't have the book.
Frankenstein, Junji Ito Story Collection.
Yeah, so you know, I don't think in the original it was sold as you know, like if you look at the cover of this, if you look at the title of this, it sounds like you're getting just the Frankenstein adaptation.
Yeah, and originally, and you did mention that, I guess the original in Japanese was volume 16 of the Junji Ito horror comic collection. And I don't know if in the original you had the additional stories or if it was just the Frankenstein adaptation.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure either. My sense is that it might have been the other stuff because like I was saying, it's, you know, it wasn't sold as Frankenstein, and then you kind of open it up and you get these other things, right? It was sold as a kind of assorted or miscellaneous collection of various short things, right? And so I'm with you. I think the thing I most enjoyed about this book was the Frankenstein adaptation, and I think one of the things we've hit on repeatedly throughout the show is that my expectation was that it was just going to be the Frankenstein adaptation, and I think that as a standalone book would probably work better. I think it would be more effective. I think you wouldn't have this confusion that I think we've had in our experience reading of it, where we're not really sure what to do with the other contents of the book, right? Because they are their own sort of thing, right? And so it's difficult to treat one and the other because they have just the most tenuous relationship.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's, unless there's something else you want to mention about this collection of stories from Ito, we can move on to another collection of stories that in many ways is more similar to the Junji Ito text than I originally thought it would be.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking that either, but you're right. They are sort of related in a way.
Yeah, and this is Shintaro Kago's Dementia 21, and this came out back in the fall from Fantagraphics. And I mentioned that this is probably more similar to the Junji Ito story collection that we were just discussing that I originally anticipated, because in many ways this reminds me of, let's say, the Oshikiri part of the Frankenstein collection we were just talking about, in that there is a story cycle-like element going on, right? We have one protagonist in Dementia 21, a young girl by the name of Yukie Sakai, who is the protagonist or the mover and the shaker in all of the 17 stories that make up this collection. Is this the first time that you were introduced, at least in full, to a Shintaro Kago text?
Yeah. Like we were talking about briefly before we started recording. I was excited when you had mentioned that you wanted to talk about this on the show because I'm familiar with Kago's name, right? As I'm sure many of our listeners are. He's someone whose work has became very popular over the last kind of 10 years or so on places like Tumblr or Twitter or Instagram, places where you can, it's very easy to share an image and reshare an image. And he was one of those guys whose work, because of the nature of it, because of it was, we were talking about it. He classifies it as, and it is classified by others as ero guru nansensu. Or erotic, grotesque nonsense. So because of this combination of sort of nonsensical images with sexual, I don't want to say themes, but with it's like not, it's the content is kind of, it's kind of nonsensical, but it has sexual elements along with violent elements. And by nonsense, I mean more so like weird. It's the sort of stuff you would just describe as weird, right? It's like a head with like overflowing with eyeballs or something like that.
Right. And that's in many of, I guess, what you could call splash pages that begin the stories, but that kind of image is, for the most part, really not a part of the various stories themselves. Yeah, and
that is something I do want to get into more fully, because that's one of the big points I want to talk about in regards to this. But to get back to your original question, because of the nature of that work, it became sort of viral on these sites, and so I'd seen it over and over and over again. I'd seen countless images that I knew were by Kago, but his work has not really been translated until now. This is the first kind of earnest mainstream licensing of his work. I say mainstream because, as we were talking about together, and I'm sure our listeners will get a kick out of this. And I can't for the life of me. It's what is it? Super Galactic Love Gun is the
Super Dimensional Love Gun.
Love Gun. Okay,
I'm glad
Super
that you
Dimensional
mentioned that. Yeah, because you and I were talking about this before we turned on the microphones. I went ahead and got a copy of and read Super Dimensional Love Gun, which is made up of 15 short pieces. And it's from a publisher by the name of Fakku. And I mentioned that to you, and you said, I think that Fakku Books may be a publisher that specializes in pornographic manga. And I looked up Fakku, and lo and behold, yes, it is a publisher that appears to specialize in hentai manga, which I'm looking at the site right now. And just to give you an example of some of the titles of the text that they publish. And I'm not even go into the description of the visuals. The visuals are everything I would have expected of a publisher like this. But titles of series like Indecent Proposal, Special Days, Titillating, S&M Ecstasy, Fanaticism, Flappy Sugar Babies, Intimate Days, Every Girl Has Her Thorns, Darling, You Drive Me Mad, and I could go on here, but let's just say that the vast majority of these titles sound rather pornographic, and yeah, I mean, they are. That's the kind of publisher this is. And Cherry and Gals, I have no problem with this. I am not a prude by any stretch of the imagination. I have nothing against, hentai, but that's just the kind of publisher this is. Now, you were saying earlier that one way of describing, or that many people have described Kago's work, is Yoro, Guro, Nonsensu. I felt that there was a lot of nonsensu in Dementia 21, not as much Irogaru, Irogura, but there is quite a bit of the erotic in the various stories that make up Super Dimensional Love Gun. And there's one in particular that I just, oh my God, it's just over the top in terms of the sex. It's called Lament of the Headless. And what Kago does is he takes a couple of Asian legends of headless spirits and applies them to a particular protagonist, a young woman who, at moments of ecstasy, when she's reaching orgasm, her head pops off. And because she is a particular kind of headless spirit, one called a penangulan, not only does her head come out, but the organs in her body that are attached to her neck also come out of the body. And so, needless to say, whenever she's having sex with someone, the guy ends up running away out of fear because he's freaked out, right? He's just brought this woman to orgasm. Her head pops off with organs attached and starts floating around the room, and the guy freaks out. And so much of the story is, Lament of the Headless, is that she can't keep a relationship. And so it just uses that as a comedic and also an erotic part, because without going into detail, you can just imagine how the bodiless head floating around can be of, how shall we say, service to certain guys. And even to herself. Again, not going into details here, but there are a lot of stories that are like this in the Super Dimensional Love Gun collection, which is the way that it's described, collects many of Kago's pretty girl stories. And so there is quite a bit more eroticism in these stories that I found in Dementia 21, which as a whole didn't come across as erotic by any means. I mean, there were one or two places that I think maybe brushed up against eroticism, but for the most part, it's much more nonsensical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
than erotic.
I agree with that, and I think Matt Seneca at the Comics Journal wrote a good review of this book that I think really gets at my feelings regarding it, which is that essentially Dementia 21 is fine. It's largely anodyne stuff. It's like the very safest of Shintaro Kago, which is an interesting choice for a publisher like Fantagraphics to make. Because on the one hand, I do understand why they might want to, why kind of their introduction or they want readers' introduction to Kago to be something that can pretty much be read by anyone, right? I don't think there's anything in here that's really that disturbing, right? It's not like Junji Ito, where this isn't a book I would recommend to a friend with a caveat like, but you got to be careful. The stuff in here is it's really kind of messed up, so you might not be able to handle it. I don't think there's anything in here that is really that shocking. Whereas I think Kago is someone who has quite a bit of work, and it sounds like Superdimensional Love Gun has a number of stories that I think would fit this description that are shocking, right? He seems like the kind of guy, based on my experience with his work, the kind of the illustrations and drawings and kind of decontextualized pages of comics that I've seen of his, they speak to someone who is capable of something a lot closer to someone else we've talked about on the show a number of times, Suehiro Maruo. We talked about the Mystery of Panorama Island. Is that the title?
Oh yeah. That was about 3 years ago.
Yeah, it was a while.
Not quite.
But so with this, I think, like I said, I understand on the one hand that decision, because you want to offer readers, you don't want to just assume readers are kind of familiar with Kago and they're kind of all in on Kago, right? Fantagraphics publishes like $20, $25, $30 books. They can't afford to be making decisions like that. So I understand that. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, I do think that the contents of Dementia 21 are largely safe. I think safe is a good word to describe them, because
I would agree. Yeah.
Which isn't to say that I disliked the book as a whole. I think there were a number of episodes in the book that I really enjoyed. I thought were clever. I thought were weird. I thought were strange. And I thought demonstrated Kago's capacity to kind of tell a really, really weird, really funny joke. As we'll kind of get into the plot or the narrative in a second, but there's a whole 20 pages or so where this character Yukie Sakai, who works as a kind of home care nurse, is tasked with like taking care of all of these old like tonkatsu characters. So like the characters you'd see on like Power Rangers who can like get really big, and they fight at like these huge sizes. It's a bunch of like those characters and like heroes and villains just sitting around like 60 feet tall, like Ant-Man or Giant Man, just like complaining about being old. And, so there's stuff like that in the book that I think is really really just terrific. It's funny. It's committed to just being weird and strange. But I think largely the book is much safer than I was hoping, and I don't think it's a good example of the work that I think that is most representative of Kago's oeuvre. I think
that story that I think you were referring to with the oversized guy who battles aliens. and him getting old and her taking care of him. I think that's story number 5. Now, in this collection, Dementia 21, actually, this is a first volume. There's going to be a second volume, and I think next year. In fact, after reading this, I have to tell you, I was bowled away. I absolutely loved this. I'm glad that this was my introduction to Kago, because if I had read before Dementia 21 the various pretty girl stories collected in Super Dimensional Love Gun, I mean, I'd still like him. It's just I'd probably be scratching my head more because there's definitely, the erotic and the strange in the various 15 stories of Super Dimensional Love Gun. But there's also quite a bit of experimentation with narrative, where to call one of the stories a narrative, maybe even stretching it at times. But I just thought that the 17 stories that make up Dementia 21 were fun. I mean, I had a great time. But story number 5, and they don't have titles, they're just numbered, is the one that you were referring to, where you have this oversized crime fighter who is old, wears a diaper, he's complaining, and then the aliens that he had battled in the past, they're getting old as well. And after a while, they all get together, both the crime fighter and the villains, and they start complaining and commiserating about shared experiences, about how they're hungry, how they're cold, they're uncomfortable, the kind of thing that stereotypical old people complain about. And actually, I would think what I just said, stereotypical old people, I think that the most offensive or most offended one could get from the various pieces in Super Dimensional Love Gun. Well, I'm sorry, Dementia 21, not Super Dimensional Love Gun. That's a whole different story. But the most offended people could get, I think, would be the various elderly stereotypes that are propagated and are used as the fulcrum of humor. It worked for me, but I can see someone who maybe works with elderly care, works in that industry, or readers who may be a little more sensitive to elderly concerns may think that Kago is playing a little loose and offensive here. I think one could make that argument. I'm not making it, but I could see where one would. Because not only does Kago in these various stories have fun with the various elderly individuals that Yukie takes care of, and she is an elderly care provider at home throughout all 17 of these stories. And, I mean, that is the consistency. That's the similarity that binds all of these short pieces together in a cycle-like manner that we were mentioning earlier. But also other stereotypes that may even be more specific to, let's say, elderly females. So, for instance, mother-in-law. I mean, there are a lot of mother-in-law jokes here, right? About how mother-in-laws always have to criticize and demean their daughter-in-law, the wife of the mother's son, the mother-in-law's son, and how the younger wives in many ways kind of buckle under that pressure. And in one of these stories literally kind of drives the young wives batty, where, they just become babbling idiots. They can't do anything anymore. They're badgered and made fun of and looked down upon to the point of being ineffective as mothers and wives and homemakers. So, or even career women. So, I mean, there are a lot of stereotypical elements in terms of the elderly, mother-in-laws, and what have you, that I think some readers may think a little heavy-handed. I thought it played well. Maybe that says something about me and my insensitivity. I don't know.
No, I think that was often I think the strongest jokes was Kago kind of preying upon these stereotypes, right? I will admit I read past the contents of the book Fantagraphics published, and so I can't recall if this story is in this first volume. But is the story where the woman's mother has to pass the it's like a civil service exam to be a professional Okay. Yeah. So there's a scene where
I think that's the last story where the woman has to make, I guess, be one of the 10, I guess, most qualified elderly in order to get certain benefits, financial and otherwise.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and,
that's story number 17,
okay.
I believe.
Yeah, I think one of the funniest jokes in the series is in that one when so the setup for listeners is it's like an alternate world where like
that's not the last one. I'm sorry to interrupt you. That's story number 14, I believe it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, as long as you know what I'm talking about. So in the future, there's like I don't know if it's the future, if it's like kind of alternate present, but it's a slightly different world than ours that has a slightly different relationship to the elderly and to elder care. And in Japan at least, there's an exam that people can take to become professional senior citizens, and this one woman's mother can't pass, and she's dismayed because she doesn't have the money to take care of her. And her mother's like, well, I've got to go do my exercise today. And her daughter, well, that's the opposite of what an old person should do. You've got to eat like an old person. You've got to eat.
Yeah.
And it's kind of cute, but then the really good joke at the end is like the final test is who can cause like trauma in their child and like force
to the
them
daughters-in-law.
to
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think there are all of these stereotypes about the elderly and about senior citizens. And I think the funniest moments in the book, I think when it really shines is when Kago really plays with that, right? So like in that instance, he's like taking these stereotypes, these ideas about how old people behave, and he's like imagining a world in which those things are like formalized, right? They're like codified into like a rigid like civil system, and just like watching that play out is this kind of absurd thing, so I think moments like that are when the book really shines, when it has fun with its concept and with this relationship it's trying to establish between like younger characters and the elderly in this kind of a weird world.
Given what you just said, I mean, it strikes me that much of what Kago is doing in terms of employing some of these elderly and mother-in-law stereotypes, he's doing it not just for the sake of the humor, but there's also some critical commentary going on that I think is culturally barbed. And, some of this may escape English readers who may not know as much about Japanese culture and the place of the elderly and some of the context surrounding that, the institutions in Japan, especially as they apply to elderly care. But I think that much of Kago's targets in some of the humor, satire, is like, for instance, what you were just mentioning in story number, 14, where the daughter-in-law is pressuring Yukie to make sure that the mother-in-law, the elderly mother-in-law, passes the exam in order to be one of the 10 worthy elderly citizens so that they could get some benefits. And so I think that there is quite a bit of political and cultural commentary going on in some of these stories. And so that's in many ways, I think, why some of these stereotypes are employed. I got a kick out of the various pieces that make up this first volume of Dementia 21. I would be hard pressed to tell you what my favorite was, but if someone held a gun to my head and asked me what my favorite one of the 17 stories are, I'd have to say story number 9. This is the one where Yukie goes to care for an aging mangaka, an artist by the name of Sohio Mitsuda. And she works with him in terms of creating manga. So Suiho makes the manga. She takes the drawn pages to a copy center, and in the midst of making copies and then stapling them together, apparently has a series of, they're like fantasies, because we see her at in the copy office. She's made, all of the brochures, the little booklets for the man she's caring for. And then she goes with him to kind of like a con where they sell the various manga that was created. And one of the stories that when she opens up the book that is created includes her. And so her going to the copy center and being a part of what happens there and eventually getting hit by a bus, I think it is, becomes almost like a Groundhog Day loop where she's stuck. And so she doesn't know how to get out of that loop. And just whenever she thinks that she's out of the loop, she's back in the copy shop and she says, oh, that must have been just daydreaming or a fantasy that I had in the midst of putting all this stuff together. She actually comes to realize that she's stuck in this mangaka's manga. And so she goes to another manga artist, a younger guy, and says, hey, I need for you to amend this story for me so I can get out of it. And so I really did enjoy that metafictional twist that I think is very apparent in this story, not so much in the others, although metafiction does become a part of many of the stories in this collection, but I think not near as prominent as we see in story number 9.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed that story as well. I thought that was one that was pretty clever as well. And if I remember correctly, the elderly mangaka is a pretty clear. It's a pretty clear drawing of like Kazuya Umezu, who. I don't think we ever got a chance to talk about it on the show. He did Drifting Classroom and The Cat Eye Boy. We did. Yeah. We were going to discuss Drifting Classroom, I think, for this year's October show, but we never were able to do it, unfortunately. Yeah. I just mentioned that because he's got a very distinct look. So I enjoyed little things like that, the fact that the mangaka was clearly Kazuya Umezu, who I think is a pretty clear influence on Kago, as well as the other person we talked about on this episode, Junji Ito. I think the book is full of that stuff, and I think that's why I didn't. I don't want to say I disliked it, primarily because I did find myself enjoying throughout those little details, and this story or that story I think would work really, really well. I thought the way we haven't mentioned this, but there's a chapter where a sentient pair of dentures tries to take over the world. That's a stupid kind of concept, but it's drawn really creepily. And I think that is, there's some genuinely kind of disturbing images in those chapters. So the book, at various points hits these notes where it's legitimately scary, or it's actually really, really funny, or really, really clever. But I think that I would have liked, I think I probably would have liked a book like Super Dimensional Love Gun a little more from Kago, because I don't know if his strong suit is necessarily sustaining narratives over a long period of time. And so I think his work really, really sings in these smaller, more compacted moments. And I think there was quite a few of those in the book, and it's why I enjoyed reading it ultimately. But I think it was ultimately there wasn't enough of that, or it was concerned with other things for long periods of time. And so I, like I said, I can definitely understand why a publisher might want to make this the first Kago book they want to translate, because it is a little more accessible than some of his other stuff,
and it's a little safer, I guess.
Right? Yeah.
Although keep in mind that Fantagraphics does have the Eros imprint.
That is true. That is true. I think safer is the word, right? Because it is light. Like, even in these moments where it starts to get a little kind of scary, or maybe a little erotic, or a little kind of grotesque, it's still ultimately fairly tame. Right. And I like I said, I understand the appeal of that as a publisher, but as a reader, I don't know if this really delivered on the Shintaro Kago experience that had kind of been built up for me over the course of the last few years, seeing his images so kind of compulsively shared by people, and seeing people get his images tattooed on their body and things like that. I had a sense of Kago as one kind of artist, and it's not. I don't want to say it's a fault of anyone that this book kind of is emblematic of a creator, of an author who doesn't necessarily fit into that image I had kind of prejudicially supposed. But I do think ultimately it didn't really live up to my expectations, and I think maybe partly that was my fault. But at the end of the day,
yeah. Well, also keep in mind that what you're seeing propagated by people on social media, especially, are going to be the more sensational images. Yeah. The manga that is probably the most erotic or controversial, that's getting a lot of attention. And I think that's one of the reasons, it kind of an opposite way of, I guess, your reading experience of this first volume of Dementia 21. I really enjoyed it. And I like the fact that there was much more of an emphasis on the nonsensical and the surreal, much more so than on the erotic, like you had in Super Dimensional Love Gun, those stories. I appreciated that. And again, there was something kind of fun and freewheeling and even satirical about the 17 short pieces that make up Dementia 21. So I mean, I really appreciated that, and I'm glad that was my first exposure to Kago. Now, I think I had mentioned a second ago that I got in touch, or I can't remember if I said this already, but I did email Gary Groth, the publisher of Fantagraphics, and he's the one who pulled this together and did the very brief interview with Kago at the back of the book. So I emailed him to say, I absolutely love this. This was my first exposure to Kago, and I'm wondering if you have plans of publishing other Kago manga in the not too distant future. And he said, actually, a second volume, or the second volume, that will follow up Dementia 21 will be coming out next. I don't know if it's next year. I hope it is. And he said that afterwards they may go on to publish other Kago works. He didn't say what, but it would be nice if we got to see more Kago in translation published through Fantagraphics, because I think they did a really nice job with this book, Dementia 21, not only in terms of the various stories that make it up in its presentation, but with Groth's interview with Kago at the very end. And one of the things that Groth says in his introduction to the interview, and I think this is putting it mildly, but that Kago's a man of few words. And so, Groth asks these rather involved and sometimes multi-layered questions. And Kago's response in many cases just a couple of sentences or three, right? For instance, there's one question that Groth asked, were you doing work of a highly personal nature from the beginning, or did you need to conform to commercial requirements? When did you find your voice as a manga artist? And then Kago's response in this brief interview is, from the beginning of my career as a professional manga artist, I mainly drew what I would like to draw. But since it is quite difficult to achieve economic success, I also wrote a lot of manga stories for the adult manga magazines, which kind of not answers Groth's questions. But, I mean, that's the kind of responses that Kago gives. And there's something kind of charming about that short interview in the back, I think. So yeah, I hope Fantagraphics does more of this stuff with Kago.
Oh, yeah. I think Fantagraphics usually does a really excellent job I think they generally do a good job of publishing high quality books, and I don't think this is an exception. I know a couple people who work over there, and I know they care greatly about everything from the content to the paper it's printed on. So like you, I thought the production quality on this was terrific, and I would like to see them kind of, in spite of my I don't want to call it ambiguity or ambivalence, but my kind of lukewarm reaction to the book. I am still interested in seeing more of Kago, because I know that this is not the kind of upper limit of his work in certain regards. So I really do hope that Fantagraphics continues to publish it. Also because I think Fantagraphics, when they publish manga or when they publish anything, it lends a certain amount of credibility, a certain amount of prestige. I think I would like to see Kago and other cartoonists like him kind of get that credibility behind them, get that support behind them, and get the opportunity to be read in these really wonderful editions. So yeah, I mean, I'm with you. I really hope they obviously they'll publish a second volume of this, like you had mentioned, but I hope their plans for publishing and licensing Kago continue on into the future.
Yeah, and I think we just scratched the surface of some of the weird wackiness that goes on in the 17 stories that make up Dementia 21. I mean, we'd be here all day if we were talking in much more depth about some of the strangeness of these stories. I mean, we have in one of them this kind of cybernetic denture that ends up taking over not only the owner's mouth, but other people's mouths. There's another elderly patient that Yukie takes care of who is not very good at driving, but she becomes a passenger when he goes driving, and they get on a series of highways that are specific to certain kinds of drivers. Again, I mean, I think, I don't know. I didn't go through and note the wild weirdness of the stories as they progress, but I was getting a sense that matters were getting weirder and weirder with the later stories. So by the time you get to the very last one, number 17, this is the one where the elderly patient that Yukie's taking care of has tons of wrinkles. She has so many wrinkles that things that have been lost in the household end up turning up in the wrinkles, including like pet bugs that people have lost, change. And then the wrinkles start accumulating, kind of like a vacuum filter, all sorts of stuff, including people. In fact, at one point, both the daughter-in-law and Yukie escape being pursued by climbing in this old woman's wrinkles, and then her wrinkles are in some kind of strange multidimensional way connected to wrinkles in other elderly patients. And so they go into the wrinkles of one elderly individual and they come out of wrinkles of another elderly individual. How they're connected, It's never explained. It's just something kind of weird portal wormhole-ish thing going on. I mean, it does get really strange, but I got the sense that as the stories progressed, they got weirder. Maybe that was just the cumulative effect of reading through this over a relatively short period of time. But I thought it was fun. I had a great time. I guess my response to Dementia 21 is much more enthusiastic than yours. Mine wasn't ambiguous at all. Mine's a go out and get this book and start reading it right now for a good time recommendation.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you ultimately that I do think it's a fun book, and I don't know if the jokes and the humor necessarily worked for me as consistently as they worked for you, but I will agree that it's a very fun book, right? Even when I don't think the stories are really totally working, it's clear that Kago is trying to have a certain amount of fun with this, right? And so even the stories that didn't really resonate with me very much, there was a certain amount of levity and humor there that did make it ultimately an enjoyable read, and it made it very compulsive to read, right? It's very easy to read one story and then quickly read another because they are short and like I said, they are light and in a lot of ways pretty breezy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Another one I just wanted to highlight. I was flipping through and I just want to mention this before we wrap up. This is story number 6. This is the one where Yukie is taken to elderly care training camp. Because apparently she's not doing a good enough job and she's not getting the high-ish ratings that she gets from those that she cares for. And so there's a drill sergeant at this camp and he runs her so ragged that she becomes almost obsessed with elderly care. And toward the end of the story, it's as if she goes on a rampage where she's destroying everyone around her and she keeps screaming, elderly care, elderly care, elderly care. And then others around her start screaming the same thing. It's like they're going crazy from being inundated with training for elderly care. And I mean, it just gets wild. So maybe it's not a cumulative effect. Maybe they don't get stranger or wilder. Maybe the earlier ones were just as wild, but I started to notice the strangeness as the stories tended to build up one right after another. And maybe that's part of the cycle experience of reading, right? Because the weirdness keeps piling itself on one story on top of another.
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to go back and reread some of those earlier stories kind of in kind of flip back and forth. The book does sort of invite a kind of freewheeling reading experience in a way, right? It's not like it doesn't insist upon this rigid reading order, right? And so I do think that it might lend itself very well to revisiting, and so I'm certainly open to doing that and giving the book another shot. Mm-hmm.
Well, Shea, thus wraps up our final manga show of 2018. For December, we looked at 2 relatively recent books. We started off with Junji Ito's latest collection, Frankenstein, the Junji Ito Story Collection. And then after that, we looked at a book that in some ways is somewhat similar to at least parts of Ito's Frankenstein, and that is Shintaro Kago's Dementia 21. Fun stuff. Some scary stuff, quite a bit of nonsensical, even Dada-esque stuff. Something for everyone.
Well, maybe not for
almost
everyone.
Right, yeah, okay, we didn't have anything approximating a rom-com, granted.
Yes.
But yeah, really fun reads, and I've had a really nice time doing this show with you, not just this past year, but over the past several years, and look forward to us looking at newer and even newer titles and older series, as we discussed at the top of the show, in 2019.
Yeah, I look forward to. I've always enjoyed. The podcast has long been a kind of edifying experience for me as well. It's an opportunity to learn new things and to read books I've wanted to for a while and authors I'd never even heard of. And I absolutely look forward to continuing it into next year because it's great and it's a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm. And if you want to find great manga like the kind Shea and I discuss every month, then you would do well to check out the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, and there you will find every month incredible discounts on manga and Western comics as well. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up your phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And as always, you can email the show by emailing twoguys@comicsalternative.com. You can email me directly at shay@comicsalternative.com. And Derek, why don't you tell the fine listeners what your email address is?
Contact me via derek@comicsalternative.com. You can also find us all over social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Podcasts. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to the website, comicsalternative.com. We will be back in the new year, and Shay, have a happy new year, my friend.
You as well, Derek.
Mm-hmm. And until January, I'm Derek.
And I'm Shay.
Take care.